So after I posted the Final Destination video, I started seeing a variation on a comment start popping up that made me think maybe we need to explore the definition of a B-movie a little more. I think this is especially relevant now because of the context in which people currently tend to deploy the term B-movie, which from what I see in horror discussions on the internet and whatnot is in implied opposition to what has come to be called elevated horror. Seems like every other week right now we're getting some kind of think piece about how prestige or elevated horror is on its way out and the way is being paved for something new, whatever style is going to define the 2020s or 2030s. I'm not going to name any names or anything, it doesn't matter, you know what I'm talking about. The 2010s was all about horror that revolved around some kind of trauma or mental illness metaphor, and that combined with a certain style resulted in elevated horror. The Babadook, Hereditary, Get Out, etc. This genre, it's said, is defined by fleshed out characters and subdued artistic editing and cinematography seemingly designed for critics, quite unlike more recent movies like The Substance, Companion, Maxine, and the like, which are colorful and bombastic, and somehow the term B-movie always gets brought into this conversation. It's the kind of debate that's really ideal for the digital age because it's sort of inherently divisive and also impossible to resolve just within the parameters of the conversation itself, because so much of what we're talking about here is so subjective. Like, elevated horror as a label is kind of insulting, right? It passively implies that all horror that happened before like 2012 could be understood as just being sort of constitutionally lowbrow. And in the 2010s, we discovered that horror could actually be really good and socially relevant, and isn't that interesting? There are a lot of problems I have with this line of discourse, but I think a good place to begin is with further defining what a B-movie actually is and how we should and should not be using that term. So just to recap, the term B-movie came from the distribution model of the early film industry, where you would buy a movie ticket for the whole day, and that would get you access to the various movies on offer for the day, usually with a headliner as the main draw, think like your average blockbuster or heavily funded Oscar bait movie, and then the B feature would be a filler movie that was usually made on the cheap and bought in some kind of package deal from the studio that likely also funded the headliner and also owned the theater. This is vertical integration, where one company owns and controls multiple levels of the supply chain of its own product. B-movies were not expected to be good, but sometimes were, and sometimes took off in their own right, or at least provided a good place for a filmmaker to hone their craft before they moved on to more serious projects. When the double feature distribution model ended, the reason the idea of a B-movie stuck around is because there was still a sector of the industry that specialized in making kind of low-rent, get-it-done type movies that served to pad the space between big Hollywood tentpole films. So here's issue number one with the way we talk about B-movies. I said in the video that B-movie should not be understood as synonymous with bad movie. In the same way, the term B-movie should also not be understood as synonymous with cheap movie. I've had a couple people comment on the Final Destination video expressing bemusement about why I'm categorizing Final Destination as a B-movie when every movie in the franchise cost millions of dollars to make. And the reason for that is that even though B-movies do tend to be cheaper than the movies studios are really banking on, price on its own is not a very reliable metric to define this with. Plenty of expensive movies suck and turn irrelevant as soon as they're released, and plenty of cheap movies, which are often independent movies, become instant hits. So defining a B-movie by cost is not very helpful. We already have words to represent relative cost in film, and those words are cheap and expensive. Principal photography for the Blair Witch Project cost under $100K, but it is not a B-movie. Blair Witch was an independent art house movie. It got bought for distribution because it was super successful at the Sundance Film Festival, which is not a place B-movies are screened. But additionally, B-movies are not directly definable by their style, which is the bigger place I see a lot of people get tripped up. There is no B-movie style. B-movies back in the day were often horror, but they were just as often westerns and romances. The style of a B-movie is simply whatever the industry bigwigs at the time don't want to risk too much money on. It'll often be culturally transgressive in some way, but it's not as if there's some eternal value for what it means to transgress. Culture changes all the time, and what's transgressive to previous generations often becomes mainstream or even cliche in the current generation. I keep seeing people describe The Substance as having a B-movie style, and that like, it just doesn't really mean anything, because when we talk about B movies, the structure we're describing is not artistic, it is industrial. What makes a B movie is that it is assumed to play a supportive role in the industry as a whole. This is different from a bad movie, which everybody hates and wishes never existed and might ruin a couple careers, and is, again, different from a cheap movie, which below a certain budget prior to 2010 or so could be expected to go straight to video and wouldn't even register for the mainstream film industry. Here's a good example of the difference at play. In the same year Final Destination 2 comes out, B movie, House of a Thousand Corpses also comes out.
Who the hell want to read about all this horse shit anyway?
You'd be surprised.
Son, look around. Would I be surprised?
It's an interesting case because it's pretty clear that it got funded with the intention of being sold as a B movie, but once it was done, Universal just didn't know what to do with it. It was too weird and therefore not marketable. And so it becomes just kind of a pain in the ass for both Rob Zombie and Universal. Eventually, Rob Zombie just decides to buy back the distribution rights from Universal and just look for somebody else. Finally, Lionsgate decides it's worth the risk, but before that, Rob Zombie was thinking he'd have to distribute it independently because there's only so much the establishment film industry will ever be willing to risk. Risk is by far the most important variable in what makes a B movie. In fact, risk is kind of the main organizing factor in film overall. This is a business, and movies are expensive. None of this shit gets made unless there's as much of a guarantee as possible that it'll make its money back. The only way out of that is if there's a bunch of private equity involved by some eccentric multimillionaire. That's how something like Phantom of the Opera gets made. That movie was all Andrew Lloyd Webber money, and what a good investment it was. Whatever, it made its money back, I guess. But very few horror directors have that kind of personal cash to spend. Rob Zombie is one, Guillermo del Toro is another. So that's what a B movie is. A B movie is something either made or bought for the intention of appealing to the most casual common denominator of the movie-going public, with the primary functions of turning a modest profit and giving people something to work on. If it does really well, so much the better. But a B movie is doing its job if it just does okay. So what does this have to do with elevated horror? Well, I'm a little confused about what exactly is meant by this term. I hear people describe elevated horror as being interested in themes and not focusing on gore and jump scares or otherwise cheap horror devices, being very serious and muted, whatever. And some movies that get cited certainly fit this mold, like The Witch comes to mind. But in other cases, it kind of seems like we're backward engineering from the conclusion we want and just memory holding aspects about these movies that don't fit that mold. Like, The Babadook has jump scares. Get Out is at least half a comedy.
Look, bruh, all I'm doing is connecting the dots. I'm taking what you presented to me, okay? I'm gonna tell you this. I think that mom is putting everybody in a trance and she fucking the shit out of them.
Thanks, Rod. Bye.
Midsommar is full of bright colors and is extremely gory. As far as I can tell, and it seems like this is the intention since we're using the word elevated, the only consistent way we're defining elevated horror is based on whether critics like it. If elevated horror can be about anyone and anything, have jump scares or not, be funny or not, take place anywhere and in any time period, and have any level of violence, then what we're describing is not really a genre. It doesn't consistently actually describe anything formal about the piece. And beyond that, critical acclaim for horror is not new. Prestige horror was one of the first things ever to happen in film. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and really the entire German Expressionist movement, was considered extremely culturally elevated. It was considered a landmark in developing film as an art form pretty much as soon as it was established. Dracula was a big deal in 1933. In the 1950s and 60s, at the same time as the true B-horror boom was at its peak, think Roger Corman, all the stuff MST3K reacts to, elevated horror was a lot of what Alfred Hitchcock was making, and Hitchcock himself was immediately recognized as one of the most important film artists of all time. The 70s had The Exorcist, The Shining came out in 1980, the 90s and early 2000s had The Sixth Sense, The Silence of the Lambs, The Others. Like everything David Lynch ever did? Like, what exactly are we talking about here? I detect in this conversation a real desire to identify what era it is we're living in right now exactly. Define its aesthetic parameters, the things we're preoccupied with as a society, whatever. Everybody wants to be the first to find the defining stylistic trend of the modern era, our flapper dresses or bell bottoms. That's what this elevated horror discussion is about at its core. What I'm a little baffled by is how discussions of what elevated horror is never seem to include the internet. I think that like B-movie, people tend to use elevated horror as a genre description when what they're actually describing is a shift in technology and industrial organization. I think we're residually accepting theater runs as the main marker of cultural legitimacy when that's not at all the role theaters play anymore. The 2010s was the decade horror started being good, and I don't think it's a mistake that that was also the decade theaters stopped being the most important initial distribution market for film and everything moved to streaming. We're still thinking of movies as properly being seen in theaters instead of your computer or TV, but the industry isn't. The reason horror looks so polished right now is because producers know instinctively that absolutely nobody is going to pay $12 for a movie ticket, plus snacks if you're civilized, to see a found footage movie anymore. That's why you pay $10 a month to Hulu, so you can go watch VHS or Hell House there. That's where movies like that belong now. It's really hard to overstate how streaming reorganized the entire structure of how movies get made. Instead of funding a lot of calculated risks across a lot of genres, big studios are now extremely incentivized to shovel all their money into a few giant projects that they can more or less guarantee a return on. That bigger upfront investment in turn means studios need to be more careful about which projects they're funding or agreeing to distribute in order to compete with streaming, which primarily means leaping the twin hurdles of convincing people to A, leave their house, and B, pay money they otherwise wouldn't have to. Streaming services, on the other hand, now have the ability and command the attention to do the opposite, to fund a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. This is how we get people simultaneously complaining that there aren't enough original movies, but also way too many movies and shows online. I do think that on final analysis, this shift from theaters to streaming is a bad cultural development, but it's certainly not because not enough stuff is being made. I have two problems with this shift, and as with so many things, they mutually constitute each other. First, the fact that theaters basically have no B-movie presence anymore is a problem because it means the interesting, trashy stuff that used to end up defining the aesthetic experience of a generation, like Final Destination, don't get anywhere near the kind of visibility theaters used to offer. They get put on streaming services and ignored by everybody except really niche genre enthusiasts. That sucks because, as we just talked about, working on B-movies has traditionally been one of the best ways to break into the industry while getting a more or less reliable return for your work. And now the gulf between people in film who can make a living and people who can't is perpetually widening. This is part of what the strikes were about. It's hard for audiences to pick up on this because it's not evident in the final product, but one of the ultimate results of streaming being the dominant distribution strategy is that the people who make it get paid a lot less. The executives get paid fine, don't you worry about them, but the actors, writers, DPs, all the people who actually make the movie and whose livelihood used to depend on residuals, or at least the projected overall income from residuals, which is the money you used to get from things like physical media sales and TV licensing, are fucked over. So those people pretty much just have to do it for the love of the game now. I do think there's an extent to which being forced to do it for the love of the game can be beneficial to the art. Call it a Laffer curve of artistic output. The Laffer curve is an economic theory that there's a sweet spot of taxation past which taxation just steals from people and keeps them from investing more into their private enterprises, and is therefore ultimately deleterious for government revenue. It's a dumb way to conceptualize taxation because there's nothing inherently good or bad about taxes in themselves. What should matter is not whether the government has less or more money. What should matter is what that money is paying for and whether those things are things that the citizens collectively think would benefit society, which is always going to be subject to change and therefore not accurately represented by a dollar value ahead of the fact. The Laffer curve is essentially describing a humanist problem and pretending it's a math problem. But because this is a humanist problem, I think it actually applies pretty well in this case. The more money sloshing around in the horror production world, the more people there are going to be in the space who don't particularly care about the product they're making, and the worse the output will be as a result. insult, which I think is why horror has so often had a reputation for being low quality. Think something like One Missed Call, Jason X, most of the Hellraiser sequels. I actually see a pretty large and healthy environment for horror production right now, in the sense that because there's less and less reliability in horror as a viable career path in film, the people making it really want to be there. The B-movies we get now that are made and bought to be supportive of the distribution model of streaming are probably better than most of the B-movies of the industry's past, but at the same time, the industry is significantly less forgiving and a significantly less stable career path than it used to be, and it was never great. But even if I thought that a general increase in the suffering of filmmakers was worth a proportionally higher quality selection of movies to choose from, I think the trade-off of a lot of movies that would otherwise get a lot of exposure and like develop the industry and the surrounding culture being dropped on streaming services on its own almost makes it not worth it. This is my second problem with the shift to streaming, which is that there really isn't a place anymore to experience B-movies communally, and that's too bad. I think it's bad for culture. I'm old enough to remember that there was a time when you would actually have to seek out entertainment. Like, you'd see what was on at the movie theater and you'd pick something to go see even if you weren't that interested in it, because what the fuck else are you gonna do as a teenager in the middle of summer vacation? I said in the Final Destination video that part of what makes that series special is that it was part of a filmmaking environment where the best thing a horror movie could be was challenging to the sensibilities of the audience. Final Destination was something that you would go see to say you could, like a scary carnival ride. This means it was partly a social experience. It was very much meant to be shared, not by explaining your reaction after the fact in a DM or a post through a phone or a computer, but in real time with real people who were aware of and watching the same thing you were. That kind of audience expectation is really only possible in a world that doesn't also have recommendation algorithms. What recommendation algorithms do is make it so you never have to be bored. They give you an endless supply of things that they think you want to see, and which usually do exist within at least a spectrum of things you want to see. I can't imagine any outcome of a system like that that doesn't involve basically a screeching halt in the development of people's personal taste. So many of the movies that were formative to me as a kid were just things I found channel surfing, which is the same kind of energy scrolling through YouTube has, except that YouTube has a recommendation algorithm and tries primarily to show you things you'll click on. If you never have to actually go out and search for something you like, it's going to be really hard to experience internal growth as it relates to art. And if no one ever has to search for something they like, then the opportunities to meet other people where they're at in their tastes and be able to identify your own dialectically by comparing yours to theirs just kind of vanishes. It's so much easier to just stay home and scroll through Instagram memes. And I don't think we've acknowledged that that has replaced what used to be intuitive avenues for entertainment, like physically getting up and going to the movies in a very real way for most people, me included. There's no friction between audience and medium in the entertainment world anymore. And I think it's pretty interesting how we're discovering on multiple fronts how no friction between customer and product can be a bad thing. I think the difference between art as entertainment and art as content is that entertainment asks something of you. There's some expectation that you should have to go out of your comfort zone a little bit, that you're investing some time and energy into this stuff instead of just having everything delivered to you while you bed rot for you to either linger on or swipe past without thinking. Going to the movies and the video store meant something different. It's a different investment. You're encountering culture in a materially different way. Rick Beato made a really good video about this last year, basically making the same point about music culture.
You actually had to expend energy riding your bike or walking to your job, working your shift, getting your paycheck at the end of the week, depositing it in the bank, getting money out, going to the record store, buying the record, bringing it home, playing it, listening to it a bunch of times, going over to your friend's house, sharing it with them. When a kid opens Spotify and clicks on a song, they can just skip to the next one if they don't like it.
Think about this.
all of the music that exists, or at least it's been uploaded to Spotify or Apple Music, is available for $10.99 a month. I'm talking about all of Michael Jackson's music, all of AC/DC, Pink Floyd, Whitney Houston, Tupac, Kendrick Lamar, Juice WRLD, Eminem, Dr. Dre, all the works of Beethoven, of Bach, of Mozart, of Stravinsky, of Shostakovich, of Charlie Parker, of John Coltrane, of Miles Davis, Brad Mehldau, of Pat Metheny, Keith Jarrett, all of that. $10.99 a month for the price of what we used to pay for one album. It's all available on these streaming platforms. Which is why music is not as valued by young people. There is no sweat equity put into obtaining it, having it be part of your collection, having it be part of your identity of who you are. These are the bands I believe in. These are the artists that I love. And I'm going to share it with my friends. I'm going to bring that record to school. I'm going to play it for my friends after school. We're all hanging out, reading the back cover of it and seeing who played on it. These things meant something. What was on here meant something. Produced by John Burns and Genesis. It was important.
It's crazy, too, because the primacy of streaming over theaters seems fairly intuitive for most conversations about the film industry. Like, when people talk about why Disney is the way it is right now, streaming is probably going to be part of that conversation. But for some reason, it's like horror occurs in a vacuum. Like, horror directors are singularly disconnected from their industrial conditions and just, like, make whatever they want, man. It's kind of flattering, I guess, in that the assumption seems to be that horror filmmakers are uniquely positioned to shirk the demands of the industry. I guess because the industry is supposed to not care about what horror does very much, even though horror has historically paid a lot of studio bills, and that's why it's such a common B-movie genre. I think this is partly just a continuance of the genre chauvinism horror has always been subject to, you know, the same condescension that convinced people an entire genre needed elevation to begin with. Good horror? How novel! How rare! Or perhaps the common rabble are finally becoming cultured. It's just a microcosm of any other kind of supremacy mindset. Certain kinds of movies aren't worth thinking about seriously because they're not supposed to be serious, and we know they're not supposed to be serious because we don't take them seriously. So what is the next wave of horror going to actually look like if we're actually talking about genre rather than just distribution models? Well, it's probably going to look pretty similar to the past 10 years since streaming took over, because it's really hard for something like a Blair Witch or a Paranormal Activity to get the kind of exposure necessary for people to decide whether or not it's working for them. Horror is a genre whose development really feeds off the kind of audience responses that are difficult to predict and typically not approved of by whatever entity or style happens to be culturally dominant at any given time. People who are culturally dominant have a pretty good incentive to maintain that dominance because it feels nice when people pay attention to your work and take it seriously. And that's not to say that those in positions of cultural dominance can't be sincere artists or produce good work. If anything, the phenomenon of elevated horror is direct evidence that they absolutely do. It's just that we can't be putting all the power of cultural creation into the hands of the few people who retain that power to the exclusion of newcomers or cultural outsiders and expect a whole lot to change over time the way it used to. My hope, what I think is possible given historical art trends, is the development of what I think might be a sort of emerging romanticist impulse, a concern among artists working in whatever given medium that there's something missing in the cultural status quo, even if they can't quite articulate what it is. To me, it looks like this tends to happen in conditions where the only people allowed to really focus on their art are people who don't have to worry very much about money. The last romanticist movement in the US occurred as inequality and industrialization were increasing and nationalism and power consolidation was on the rise. And the people working within the romanticist literary tradition were pretty much uniformly from established and important families that were at least comfortable, if not rich. I think the sort of bombasticness of horror right now that people keep describing as a B-movie style is maybe just the emotional expressiveness of romanticism. Think of the kind of story Edgar Allan Poe writes. He was part of the romanticist tradition. Highly aestheticized, concerned concerned with paranoia and phobia, focused on a real mental anguish, but less in an analytic, metaphorical way like The Babadook, and more in a visceral, emotional way, investigating what mental imbalance feels like to experience rather than self-consciously holding forth about what one must do to resolve that mental instability. Sinners is absolutely a romanticist movie, but I would argue that The Substance is too. It's a movie that's heavily aestheticized, concerned with paranoia and phobia, and focused on emotionality. Companion is just a dark romance, straight up. I saw the TV Glow, the X Trilogy, Nosferatu. These are romanticist, I think. Even Final Destination Bloodline's family element strikes me as kind of a romanticist twist in an otherwise very brutalist franchise. But the thing is that all of this whole romanticism thing I'm describing, that's still elevated. It's still very much legitimized as good art in mainstream culture. The Substance premiered at Cannes and won Best Original Screenplay. This is not something that happens with actual camp or B movies. Cannes is pretty much as elevated as it gets. Cultural trash simply does not premiere at elite film festivals ever. So when I say we need to be making more trash and that making trash is a noble pursuit, especially now, what I'm saying is that the art being produced and made widely available to people is pretty much exclusively top down. The cultural elite speaking to an ever-growing population of commoners who are expected to mostly stay silent. Not good. I genuinely think a lot of our social dysfunctions right now are symptomatic, if not directly caused, by this increased stratification between the kinds of professional culture workers who have institutional support and those who don't. Institutional support can mean a lot of things. When I was growing up, it seemed like the free market worked okay for organizing American film culture and ensuring there was variety and access, but technology is different now, and increasingly it seems like the movies that break through the status quo and become really successful have the institutional support of government art grants. That's largely what's happening in South Korea and Australia and a lot of Europe, and look what's happened. Americans are now expected to tolerate subtitles. I cannot express strongly enough how impossible that would have seemed to the average American moviegoer of 2005. So yeah, I don't exactly know why it is we're pretending that what horror produces can be analyzed independently from how it's produced, but I do think that we would benefit from acknowledging that it's not 2005 anymore, and it really is not necessary for us to do the industry's job for it and bend over backwards trying to justify the idea that critically approved is an artistic genre, because it isn't. But I'm open to being convinced, so let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next month for the next Lord of the Rings video. Okay, goodbye. Before I go here, I just want to tell you about a friend and member of this community, such as it is. A viewer named Josie is raising money to fund her school and immigration applications from India to Europe. Long story short, she had been applying to master's programs in Germany, but discovered during the process that the school she had been doing her bachelor's at had lost its accreditation without telling anyone. It looks like she'll have to start her bachelor's over again and would very much like to do that in Europe, where she'll have access to the best educational resources available and will no longer have to rely on closeting herself from her extremely transphobic family. Josie is just a remarkably intelligent and kind person. She's exactly the kind of person we should want in academia. Anyone in the kind of unsupportive position she's in deserves to get out, but she specifically has some serious potential to fulfill. So follow the link that should be on the screen now, and if you've got an extra $5 or something, please consider donating. If you don't have an extra few bucks, consider just sharing the link wherever you can. Any kind of amplification is going to help.